If we go ahead and we take a look at the stomach, we can go ahead and put the lumen of the stomach over here. Okay. And then we can have our sort of ECF or interstitial fluid over here, right? And we can have our cells sort of lined up on this side over here, right? And if we look at this, right, we can have inside of here, we can have our sensory neurons. So I'm just going to draw that like this. This is going to be a sensory neuron. Okay. And I'm going to draw another sensory neuron down here. Okay. And along the sort of epithelium, right, I'm going to draw our different cells. So here we have a G cell. There we've got a D cell. I'm going to put P for parietal. And then down here, I'll put C for chief cell. Right, so these are all the different sort of cell types that are going to be present. Now, we know that our parietal cell is going to secrete, let's go ahead and make this yellow, right, our proton and our chloride ion to make our hydrochloric acid. Our chief cell is going to secrete pepsinogen. And we know that pepsinogen is converted over into pepsin. Okay? Now, we know that this proton is what activates that, right? And that hydrochloric acid helps convert that pepsinogen over to that pepsin, right? So it activates that. Our D cell is going to release somatostatin. And it's going to do so into sort of the ECF, all right? And then over here, I'm going to draw another cell, and this is going to be our ECL cell, okay? And our ECL cell is going to secrete histamine. Right? So our histamine is going to act on our parietal cell. So let's make this one green. This is going to be activation, right? So it is going to act on our parietal cell. Now, what that somatostatin is going to do is that somatostatin will actually inhibit that ECL cell. So that will sort of decrease that sort of production. If we look at our G cell is going to secrete gastrin. And we know that gastrin is one of the things that comes down and it is going to activate that parietal cell. Right? So the other thing that our somatostatin is going to do is it will inhibit that G cell. Right? So somatostatin is our inhibitory nature. If we look at sort of the nervous system, we can have amino acids out here, and those can be picked up by receptors on that sensory neuron, and those sensory neurons then can send a signal to the G cell and have it secrete gastrin. Right? The other thing is that the proton can activate these sensory neurons down here, and that sensory neuron can then send a signal over to our chief cell. Okay. And then last but not least is we have our sort of brain up here. Right? And it can send acetylcholine, our signal, down to the parietal cell, right, to produce our proton. Right? And so here we have basically the overall pathway of everything that sort of integrates with everything, right? So our gastrin, right? Gastrin here is, let's go ahead and pick up our laser pointer here, right? It is going to, our G cell is going to make our gastrin, right? So there we have our gastrin, and our gastrin can come all the way down to the parietal cell and cause the release of the proton, right? Our ECL cell can cause the release of histamine, which acts on the parietal cell, causes the release of the proton. The brain can generate a signal that will act on the release of acetylcholine to act on our parietal cell to secrete the proton. Once the proton is released, it can be picked up by sensory neurons that will then send the signal to our chief cells to secrete pepsinogen, right? That enzyme, in order to do so. Now, once that is all said and done, right, then we can have our D cell, our somatostatin producing cell, right, have sort of a feedback where the proton will activate that D cell, which will then release somatostatin and say, okay, let's stop releasing histamine, let's stop releasing gastrin, and that will overall reduce the amount of proton being present. So there you have a negative feedback loop inside of the GI tract with your proton and your D cell, which then is going to inhibit gastrin release, inhibit histamine release, which will then reduce or inhibit that overall proton release. Right? So take a few minutes, draw that out, make sure that you understand the overall linkage between all these different entities inside of the stomach to overall regulate stomach activity.